Hi, it's me. It's part 2 of our look at animals that evolved in strange ways. And today, you're looking at animals so bizarre they couldn't possibly exist if they weren't real. Welcome to the channel. First, we have to look at this beast. This is a relative of the dinosaur called the Ankylosaurus. The reason it makes no sense is its armor. It looks like someone took a Volkswagen Beetle and covered it in massive plates of armor. It would be very hard to do anything with such a heavy shell. Its legs seem too skinny to support its body. And then there's its face. It looks like a pig crossed with a turtle. And then there's its tail. It's got 2 spikes at the end of it, but what was it for? Some say it's for defense, but some think it's used to smash through skulls. They lived until around 66 million years ago when the asteroids came and killed off most life on Earth. But why did they evolve this way? Well, they descended from small proto-ankylosaurs that looked like modern lizards. But the Triassic period they lived in was dangerous. There were meat-eating relatives of the crocodile everywhere. So they evolved armor to protect themselves. The trick was getting that armor without being totally immobile. The solution, oddly enough, was to mimic the shell of a turtle. Even though they aren't related, their ancestors slowly grew more and more turtle-like, gaining bigger shells and smaller tails. Eventually, they gained a shell so big, it took up half their body length. After the Triassic, things calmed down and they didn't need protection so much anymore. But by then, evolution had made them into this. The biggest ones weighed more than a ton and were as long as a Tyrannosaurus rex. Today, only one type of ankylosaur remains, the short-faced broad-snouted armadillo. Moving from monsters to magnificent beasts, let's look at the red deer. There's something weird about it, but what is it? Well, every male deer has antlers, even the closest relatives of the deer. But not these guys. That's because they don't need them. See, all deer live in forests, and most of their predators are poor at seeing through trees. So, antlers aren't really necessary. That is, except when you get to the males of this species. They live in open grasslands where there are lots of predators. So the males have evolved to have huge sets of antlers. But that isn't the strange thing. That's just normal deer stuff. The weird thing is the females. They also don't need antlers, but they still grow them. Why would they? Well, the males use their antlers for fighting other males. But what do the females use them for? Well, weirdly, it seems like they use them to fight each other. Female red deer will clash their antlers together violently. Scientists think this is to establish a dominance hierarchy, sort of like how chickens peck each other to establish which one is top hen. And by establishing dominance, they reduce the amount of stress they experience. But why do they do that instead of just figuring out who's boss for belly or something? Well, maybe it's because of those male deer with their stupid big antlers. The females have evolved to grow antlers just as big to defend themselves against the males. Males don't fight with their females. In fact, they only really ever fight other males. That means that females fight each other and have to defend themselves against males who might try to forcibly mate with them. Males compete for access to females, and females compete for access to resources. That's why they both need antlers. Next, let us look at a creature that looks like someone smashed together the head of a giraffe and the body of a tapir. And of course, it's got the neck of a camel. Neat Okapi. The weird thing about the Okapi is it evolved recently, but it's very primitive. You see, it's a relative of the giraffe. But, unlike the giraffe, it hasn't changed much over the past few million years. Giraffes evolved from short-necked African ancestors that stood around 4 feet tall. The oldest fossils we've found are around 7 million years old. And since then, giraffes have grown taller and taller until today. But the Okapi is just like their ancestors. It stands around 5 feet tall, has a short neck, and looks just like a giant deer. But it's not a deer. It's a relative of the giraffe. Why did it stop evolving? Well, the answer may be that it doesn't need to evolve. When it comes to natural selection, it's all about what's advantageous. If you're well suited to your environment, you don't need to change. And the okapi is well suited to its environment. Its ancestors probably looked similar to modern okapi. They lived in the tropical forests of Central Africa, where the tall trees meant that being tall wasn't really an advantage. If you were tall, you'd get more food, sure. But you'd also be much more visible to predators. In fact, being tall might even make you hotter, since being big makes you lose water faster. But if you're small, you can stay hidden among the trees and sneak around. And that's probably what the ancestors of the okapi did. Then when humans came along, things changed for the giraffe. We started hunting them, and if you're a giraffe, being tall is helpful, since then you can reach leaves that humans can't. But for the okapi, it didn't really matter. Humans couldn't easily spot them in the forest, so there was no advantage to being tall. Now we have to look at a weird fish that somehow got trapped on land. It's called a mudskipper. It's a little fish that lives in rivers in Europe and Asia. But there's something weird about it. While it's in the river, it's totally normal. It swims around and does fishy things. But when it rains, it does something weird. It crawls out of the water onto land. On land, it kind of slithers using its belly and pectoral fins. It almost looks like it's walking, but then it does something that makes no sense. It walks away from the water, often quite far. Sometimes they'll go into people's gardens. And sometimes they'll even walk into people's houses. But eventually, after a while, they'll flop back into the water. They usually crawl out of the water to find new sources of food. Sometimes they'll eat aquatic invertebrates that live on land. But scientists think they also crawl out of the water to escape predators. After all, it's very hard for fish to hunt them on land. Mudskippers evolved around 66 million years ago. Back then, most of the world's rivers were full of dinosaurs. Some of these dinosaurs were amphibious, meaning they could live both on land and in water. They were basically the predator of both worlds. So the fish that could leave the water were at a big disadvantage. So the fish that could leave the water were more likely to survive, pass on their genes, and eventually evolve into today's mudskippers. But now we have to look at something truly terrifying. Meet the megalodon. This is the largest shark that ever lived. It was around 15 meters long and weighed over 60 tons. It had huge serrated teeth that could grow 20 centimeters wide. It was basically the apex predator of the oceans, but it went extinct around 23 million years ago. But why? Well, the megalodon's ancestors were normal great white sharks that fed on fish and seals. But over time, they kept growing bigger and bigger. They grew bigger until they were as big as buses. But why did they keep growing bigger? Well, strangely, it seems to be because of the whales. Whales and sharks are archenemies. They've been trying to kill each other since the first whale and the first shark ever evolved. And as whales evolved, they became bigger. So the sharks kept growing bigger to catch them. At some point, though, you can't keep growing forever. The bigger you get, the more food you need to eat. And eventually the ocean just can't provide enough food for a shark that big. And that's what happened to the megalodon. It couldn't find enough food, so it went extinct. But luckily for us, it only ate fish and marine mammals. If it had had opposable thumbs, it could have come out of the water and hunted us. But now we have to look at a relative of the platypus that can kill you in seconds. It's called a numbat. It's a small mammal that feeds on termites. They're around the size of a squirrel and live in Australia. They've got a long sticky tongue that they use to slurp up termites. But they've also got a weird duck-like bill. This is used to sniff out termite nests. They also use it to prod the ground and find worms. Their bill works really well for this job, but why do they have a duck-like bill? Well, weirdly, this is a completely separate evolution. See, the duck-like bill is actually made from the same stuff as their nose. It's just grown outwards. As they evolved, the numbat's ancestor was an insect-eating animal that looked like a mole. But as Australia dried out, the moles all went extinct. All except one group. This group adapted to the dry conditions and became the numbat. They were nocturnal and insectivorous. Their snouts weren't great at sniffing out insects, so they grew longer and longer until they turned into today's duckbill. But now we have to look at one of the strangest animals on Earth. It's called a blobfish. It's a deep-sea fish that looks like a pile of goo. Its head is massive compared to its tiny little body. That's because it's full of slime. That slime gives it buoyancy so it can float near the surface without sinking. But weirdly, it's also incredibly ugly. Because of this, it's been dubbed the world's ugliest animal. But why did it evolve this way? Well, it turns out that it's just how this fish works. Their bodies are made of flesh and mucus. They use this mucus to control their buoyancy and move through the water. They also use it to protect themselves from predators. Basically, it's just how their bodies work. But when it gets near the surface, it's in a whole different world. Deep down, the pressure is thousands of times greater than it is at the surface. The blobfish has evolved to survive this crushing pressure. It's thought that if it was brought to the surface too quickly, the pressure difference would cause its eyes to explode. So in its natural habitat, it's perfectly adapted. But to us, it looks like an alien. If you want to know more about strange animals, watch this video. Or this one.